Kenny Bearfield has a book called The Prophet Motive, which traces the penalties of Bible prophecies made against 10 Old Testament nations. Excellent book for anybody that's interested in how Bible prophecy applies to physical nations. Excellent book. It includes prophecies against Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and a bunch of other ones. Each prophecy is unique to each nation, and each result is exact in its outcomes. It's a very accurate, shows the accuracy of Bible prophecy over a period of a couple thousand years. Slide. Chapter 10 deals with the prophecies against Tyre in Bearfield's book. Tyre is mentioned in Isaiah and Zechariah, but it is Ezekiel that makes the most vivid predictions about Tyre. Tyre was a city like Geneva. It was a neutral country like Switzerland, and it had the corner on the world banking at the time. But Tyre was called a harlot by God because she caused destruction and induced uncleanness among the nations by economically dominating them and influencing them by her idolatry. So God's prophets foretold the things that would happen to Tyre in the future. Slide. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, was going to destroy Tyre. Many other nations would gang up on Tyre. This was unusual because Tyre, being something like Switzerland, it was neutral. So it was unheard of at the time for that sort of thing to happen. Tyre will become flat like the top of a rock, but that was also unusual because they hated fishermen. They were a banking city. They were like uppity. They hated that sort of thing. All of the city would be thrown into the water, which was something at the time that was never done because materials were saved for another project. And then another prophecy was that Tyre would never be rebuilt. Slide. 3 years later, Nebuchadnezzar, in around 600 BC, laid siege to the city. The siege lasted 13 years. Tyre asked Nebuchadnezzar to back off for a bit and they would surrender. So he agreed, but Tyre never came out. Instead, Nebuchadnezzar went back into the city, found that there wasn't anybody there. The people had left the city by boat and sailed across to the little island a half a mile away. And since Nebuchadnezzar had no army and he hated boats, he got angry and he ransacked the city instead. Slide. And then almost 300 years later, Alexander the Great was conquering the known world and demanded that all cities have their gates open when he arrived. But again, Tyre refused. So he broke into the city, but again, nobody was home. They had knew he was coming. They had gone over to the island again. So to fulfill another prophecy that said that Tyre would be thrown into the sea, that's exactly what Alexander the Great did. He tore the city walls down block by block, threw it into the water there, until he built a causeway that went all the way across to the island. Slide. And that is kind of the coastline there, and then Tyre on the island itself, and that's the causeway that he made. So he tore the city down to do this. Slide. It took 2 years. 8,000 were killed, 30,000 were sold into slavery, and the city was laid waste. This is what that particular place looks like now. It's all filled in. It's not just a single causeway. It's a lot wider today, but this is an aerial shot of the exact same location. Tyre was torn down every time anyone tried to rebuild it over the next 1,000 years, just like predicted by the Old Testament prophets. When the Muslims came and the Crusades came, etc., it was destroyed every time they tried to rebuild it. Slide. Ezekiel chapter 26 mentions that they shall destroy the walls of Tyre and break down the towers, and I will scrape her soil from her and make her a bare rock. She will be in the midst of the sea, a place for spreading nets. And as we said, that's something that Tyre would have refused in the past. But, slide, this is Tyre today. Fishermen dry their nets there, and there's quite a fishing community in the area. And that's all it is. It's a bare rock. There's no big city, etc., like there was during the time when these Old Testament prophets predicted. In Revelation chapter 17, another character is introduced. It's the harlot. Together, Babylon and the harlot become symbols of this kind of the same thing. Babylon serves the beast, which in turn serves the dragon. Symbolically, Babylon is any world system that serves the axis of evil, the dragon, the beast, and a false prophet. One of the main Old Testament allusions in this is in Revelation chapter 17 and 18, where it talks about being this idea of being a harlot, etc., related to the idea that's what Tyre was. So, slide. Isaiah chapter 23. Tyre will play the harlot with all the kingdoms of the face of the earth. Slide. And Isaiah 23, starting in 15, says, Tyre will be forgotten. It will happen to Tyre as in the song of the harlot, take up a harp and walk through the city, you forgotten harlot. Tyre, the city, was called a harlot because she caused destruction and introduced uncleanness among the nations, both economically and idolatry-wise. And now the same thing is being described about Babylon here in Revelation. Like the great Babylon fell, so did Tyre. Tyre was given the designation of being a harlot because she had prostituted herself to other gods and forsaken Jehovah. Tyre is also described this way throughout Ezekiel chapter 26, 27, and 28. And thus becomes a model of the world system as represented by Babylon throughout Revelation 17 and 18. So, it's just another way that John is using allusions both to two different places kind of at the same time because of how they're described by Old Testament prophets. Remember, Babylon is not to be understood as a physical place in Revelation. It is a symbol that has been set up in the pages of a cleverly written book as the all-encompassing city of evil. All wicked systems take the symbolic name Babylon the Great in the book of Revelation. Babylon serves the beast, which in turn serves the dragon. And in Revelation, all of Revelation 17 through the first part of 19 is one huge interpretive snapshot of the sixth and seventh bowls, which of course have foretold the judgment against Babylon. Finally, beginning in chapter 19, we will see Christ's triumph over these forces of evil. It is chapter 17, the one we are on today, that emphasizes what leads up to this demise of Babylon. Slide. Revelation 17, 1 and 2. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who is seated upon the waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. And I will, and with the wine of those of whose fornication the dwellers on earth will become drunk. This judgment is yet another mention of God's answer to the prayer of the saints back in 6:10 when they said, How long? You remember we brought that up several times. The question was back then, the church is being persecuted. How long is this going to happen? Because they can only take so much, but God keeps telling them to hold in there. The angel speaks to John in words that come from Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 13. Slide. O you who dwell by many waters, abundant treasures, your end has come. Revelation, especially throughout these chapters, presents two ways of life. Slide. One way serves God, the other serves the beast. One way fellowships the church, the other sells its soul to the world. And one way lives for what will last forever, and the other, of course, is locked in on looking at what is good in the here and now. Every person needs to be convinced that it is better to live for the Lamb than it is to live for the beast. Living for the Lamb as his pure bride, as we're going to see in the coming chapters, living for the Lamb as his pure bride is better than living for the beast as his whore. This is going to be what the contrast that we should be seeing throughout this chapter and the ones that are coming following. And it's an important contrast. This is what this section is trying to shock the reader into accepting. What John sees in this vision is a human female being symbolically personified as a harlot who has left the one to whom she owes allegiance. In verse 2, the angel tells John two things. The first one is, kings of the earth have committed harlotry, and the second one is, the earth dwellers have become drunk on what has been promised. The world rulers have gone to the harlot to pursue their own glory, their own name, and their own purposes, all while ignoring God's law, his glory, and his purposes. Earth dwellers, you remember that's talking about people that desire the earth over spiritual things. So earth dwellers or earth dwelling people, unbelievers, have become intoxicated with the vain promises that the world has to offer rather than loving and serving God. And therefore, the wine of the world's disregard for God has made all unbelievers drunk and left them in a godless stupor, blind to what God claims. Slide. Verse 3 says, and he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. This recalls the beast back in Revelation chapter 13, verse 4, that was speaking blasphemies. They are one and the same. The harlot speaks where the beast speaks instead of speaking the words spoken by the Lamb. The Old Testament allusion is to the beasts in Daniel chapter 7, which had a total of 7 horns, and with Daniel's 4th beast, which had 10 horns. Notice in verse 4 the description of how the harlot is clothed. Slide. It's arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding a golden cup, and writing blasphemies on her forehead. She is arrayed with everything that the world has to offer. The scarlet symbolically associates with her with the dragon. The writing on her forehead brings to mind the mark of the beast back in chapter 13. This is also an allusion to Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 7, where it says, slide, Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand. She made the whole earth drunk. The nations drank her wine. Therefore, they have now gone mad. But the true nature of this harlot is revealed in verse 5 and 6. Slide. On her forehead was written the name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. This woman's allegiance is plain for all to see. There is an allusion to Daniel chapter 4, verse 30, where Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, boasts, slide, is this not the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence by my mighty hands and for the glory of my majesty? We dealt a little bit of this a couple weeks ago or so. The mystery being talked about back up in the other verse we just read, spoken of in verse 6, is to be seen as a contrast to the mystery of Christ in chapter 10, verse 7. We discussed that earlier also. Nebuchadnezzar was warned by Daniel of the disaster ahead should he continue in his pride. The same thing in a symbolic sense is happening here in chapter 17. Symbolic Babylon will also fall because of its pride and evil ways. There are 4 women that are portrayed as a whole in Revelation. Slide. 2 of them are good, 2 of them are evil. The harlot, here in chapter 17, Babylon itself is portrayed as a woman earlier on in coming up in chapter 18, as being in the desert. And there is, of course, the woman with child we talked about in chapter 12, who dwells in the wilderness. And then the bride, which is coming up in chapter 19 and 21. These women are to be contrasted. Like I said, 2 are evil, 2 are good. 2 are earth dwellers and follow the beast in its attempt to devour the saints. But the woman with child gives birth to the church, and the bride is the church that follows the Lamb. We are not to identify any of these as specific people or kingdom, as some try to do. All 4 of them are symbolic and are meant to be contrasted with each other. When John saw this, we are told that he marveled greatly. But if you think about it, John had been taught by the Master himself, face to face. In fact, in John chapter 15, go ahead, slide. It says, if you belong to the world, it will love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember that I told you a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecute me, then they will persecute you also. If they obey my teachings, they will obey yours also. They will treat you this way because of my name, which may be part of the reason why the angel asked John, why do you marvel? Because he'd heard some of these words right from Jesus from the beginning. John had already heard Jesus say this same sort of thing to him. Beginning in verse 8, the threefold description of God is given. The same way that it's given back in chapter 1, verse 4, chapter 4, verse 8, chapter 11, verse 17, chapter 16, verse 5. But this time it's altered and can apply, so it can apply to the beast instead. In this passage, it first says that the beast was and was not. Then, instead of finishing God's sketch, it takes the beast and says something slightly different. In fact, let's make a comparison here between the two. Slide. On the left side, we see the ones from Revelation, and there's several places where it says it. I simply have chapter 1, verse 4 here. The one who was, who is, and is to come. In other words, the summation of the great I am. But on the right side here in chapter 17, when it describes the beasts as a descriptor, it says who was, which is the same, but who is not, and then who is about to come out of the abyss and go to destruction. So he's using kind of a play on words here, kind of a contrast between what the beast is going to suffer and what God actually is, which I think is kind of interesting. The point is that God is eternal. The beast is not. The dragon and his entourage is going to be something that God will judge. God is the judge. They are going to be judged. Though the beast appears to be defeating the church, his illusion of victory will be short-lived, and because it states that he will soon go to destruction. This is the same as we read in 13:8, where we are told how the multitudes were amazed at the beast's recovery. This is back in chapter 13. Remember that the beast seemed to recover from its fatal wound inflicted by the cross and the resurrection. But in the end, the earth dwellers will not be able to withstand the deception of the beast because their names are not written in the book of life. Slide. Verse 9 says that the 7 heads and the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. All occurrences of mountains in Revelation are understood figuratively. They are all symbols. There are some that try to tell us that they are specific mountains that represent modern day places or places in antiquity, but basically they are symbolic throughout the Old Testament, and they're used symbolically here in Revelation. It is unlikely that this verse 9 is any different than any of the rest of them. In the Old Testament, mountains also symbolize kingdoms in places such as Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and Zechariah. Just as the kingdoms with the 7 horns in Daniel chapter 7, starting in verse 4, span a long period of time, likewise, these mountains in Revelation chapter 17, which is based on Daniel, are also meant to span centuries, like maybe the time from when Jesus died until he and resurrected until the time he returns. Okay? The same is true in verse 11. Slide. The numbers here do not imply any specific person or nation, and some think that they do, but they do not. Like all other numbers in Revelation, they are symbolic. But there's a problem here. We've got the number 8, which is not one of our special numbers that we talked about. So that kind of has to have a little bit of an explanation. Now we're going to do so by taking a look at a place like Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16. Slide. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. This is kind of a Hebrew idiom, a way of writing. It's known as graded numerical, and it uses 2 consecutive numbers in parallel to indicate something that is illustrative and representative rather than literal and exhaustive. In this passage in Proverbs, it's used to represent all sin. There are 6 things that God hates, 7 that is detestable. It's a way of saying God hates all sin. All right? This sort of thing is also used in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 2, where it talks about 7 followed by 8. And in Micah chapter 5, where it speaks of 7 shepherds and 8 leaders of men. This kind of thing is used all over the Old Testament for emphasis. And it looks like, to me at least, that John is not counting how many emperors here as much as he is illustrating all evil. That's what the illustration is for, and he's using that same sort of idiom to do that. Likewise, in verse 12, slide, it states that the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received the kingdom. If you remember, that 10 is one of those special symbolic numbers. And in fact, 10 represents the divine order. And for those who remember our Genesis class way, way back, 10 is also associated with the number of kingdoms in Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 11. There's a kind of a parallel number of kingdoms there that's being talked about. The 10 horns are identical to the kings of the earth in 1718, which is parallel to the kings of the earth back in 1614 and 1919 coming up shortly. These 10 horns and kings refer to allies of the beast, those who fight against the Lamb of God. Like so many other things in Revelation, these 10 horns and kings span this entire time of the 1,260 days, the 42 weeks, etc. This time from when Jesus died and was resurrected until the time he returns. Their purpose is to wage war against the Lamb. But verse 14 tells us, once again, that the Lamb will overcome them. Let's take a comparison real quick to Revelation chapter 17, verse 14, and Daniel chapter 7, verse 21. Slide. Daniel 7:21, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them. In Revelation chapter 17, verse 14, they will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them. In both passages, kings are portrayed as horns. That's important to remember. But something is also important here. There's a switcheroo going on between what Daniel said and what John is interpreting it and using it in his own way. The wording and the results are reversed. Notice at the end specifically that it is these horns or these evil kings against the holy people, and they're going to defeat them. But in the end, in Revelation, what it says is that these horns make war on the Lamb, but the Lamb conquers them. Okay? A great contrast here. And John's picking up on Daniel, but changing it. In both passages, kings are portrayed as horns, but they're, like I said, there's a switch. In Revelation, the Lamb who conquers the agents of the enemy, and not the other way around. In Daniel chapter 4, God is referred to as the one who demonstrates his truth and has all divine sovereignty. Nebuchadnezzar, who we've mentioned over and over again, which is in the book of Daniel, king of Babylon, of course, attempted to lay claim to God's title. But instead, Babylon the Great is judged, and Nebuchadnezzar is shown to be the beast he really was when he is forced to eat grass like an oxen, if you remember your stories from Daniel. Slide. In Revelation chapter 17:14, the Lamb is shown to be what Nebuchadnezzar never could be. The Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. Nebuchadnezzar had set himself up as Babylon the Great. What kind of God is saying here is that Jesus is the greater, the actual King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Therefore, it is the Lamb who demonstrates his deity by judging the beast, and he exposes as false the divine claim of anyone who attempts to take the title for their own. Slide. Revelation chapter 17, verse 15, the angel continues to interpret what John sees. The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are people and multitudes and nations and tongues. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel all use the metaphor of many waters for many nations. And of course, these many nations is a reference to the idea that we're not talking anymore about just Jew or Greek. We're talking about the entire world. In verse 16, slide, it says that, and the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her with fire. This is taken directly from Ezekiel chapter 23, verses 25 through 29 and verse 47. In Ezekiel, it is Israel who is playing the harlot. Slide. But the message is still the same. This passage says in part that your survivors will be consumed with fire. They will also strip you of your clothes, and they will deal with you in hatred and leave you naked and bare, and the nakedness of your harlotries shall be uncovered, and finally they will burn the houses with fire. So you can see there's a direct relationship between what's being said in this passage in Revelation and where John draws from it back in Old Testament passages, which is what we said all along is happening. Pretty much the majority of Revelation is nothing but quoting Old Testament scriptures, or at least alluding to them, and John fitting them together in ways for us to symbolically understand what's happening here on earth and in heaven until Jesus returns. This same imagery is now reapplied from, what was it? It was Ezekiel, right? Yeah. It's reapplied from Ezekiel. What real life Babylon did to Israel is now being applied symbolically and is happening to the entire world system, which is also known as Babylon. Think a minute about all of this imagery of the world system of evil being symbolized by a harlot. We've talked a lot about it today, and that's been kind of the emphasis of what we've been trying to get across, I think. Think of how foolish and twisted and hopeless it is for any attempt to buy joy and peace from this kind of system. I mean, think about it brings to mind the old Beatles song, Can't Buy Me Love. John is drawing an image of how unbelievers have or are trying to purchase what God offers for free if they will only commit to him instead of to the beast. But if you are not faithful to God, then no one is going to be faithful to you. God is always faithful. But one of the things I think that's being shown throughout this passage is that no matter how faithful God is, if you turn to the other system is not going to be faithful to you. And you've lost. Think about this. Anyone who is not faithful to God cannot be trusted. Therefore, the kings of the world turn on the very things that they have used for their own pleasure. Thus, we see the harlot being destroyed by her own customers. If left to its own demise, the world is going to self-destruct. This is not simply blind fate. This is God's justice, as the angel explains in chapter 17, verse 17. Slide. For God has put into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. As we have said before, God works his will through any means that he wishes. He even uses those who oppose his purpose. God is holy, righteous, and good. He is not evil. He is not tempted by evil. Nor does he tempt anyone, as we know from Scripture. But evil is outside of God's even being outside of God's control as far as who's going to do it. It is God and God alone who will keep all of his words. He will fulfill every promise that he has ever made, and if he needs to use the evil of those that commit evil to accomplish his purposes, he'll do that. So be it. He'll use evil. He's not evil. He'll use it to his own purposes. Soon, we will read about the bride of Christ in chapter 21. At that point, we will see that there are many parallels between the harlot in 17 and the other woman in chapter 21, the bride. These parallels are to be points of contrast. Slide. Here's what we're going to see. I mean, we've already seen a little bit of the harlot right here is what we've been discussing, but we're going to get to 21 before too long, and this is the contrast we're supposed to see between the two. One is a pure bride, and the other is an impure harlot. The language introducing each of these is almost identical. Both are adorned with costly jewels and linen. The harlot's outward attire hides her inner corruption, but the bride reveals the glory of God. One woman relies on heaven, where the other one relies on the kings of the earth. And finally, each is seen in the desert and referred to as a city in those corresponding verses. So, the harlot is not any specific person, place, or thing. It is a symbol of all those who live in Babylon and follow the beast. Whereas the bride, coming up in chapter 21, is not any specific individual either. The bride here, there is symbolic of a symbol used by God to designate the church, the bride of Christ. The harlot will self-destruct, but the bride of Christ, as we are going to see, will live throughout eternity with the bridegroom. So these symbols, we shouldn't just sit there and try to figure out, okay, who is the harlot talking about? Who is this talking about and that talking about? We need to often see what is the contrast between the characters so that we know the difference between dwelling on the earth and looking forward to our spiritual home. That's kind of what Revelation is trying to do in a lot of ways. Any questions or comment?